This particular panel is something that has been very close to what I've worked on. The subjects have been close to what I've worked on for years. I'm just going to use a word from a writer who I deeply admire. The geography of hope. That's what Wallace Stegner called the wild sections of America's public lands. Now, he was talking about wilderness and the human spirit. But the geography of hope, as a phrase, applies equally well to public lands and the future of the planet's climate and its biological riches. Public lands make up nearly a third of the landmass of the United States, about 620 million acres. It's held in trust for future generations, and it's also central to our well-being today, critical to the quality of the air we breathe and the water we drink. Among the public lands that you all know about or know something about are the Grand Canyon, Utah's Canyonlands National Park, and the wild peaks of Idaho's Boulder White Clouds, which are just a few miles from here. The West, the states around us, are ground zero for public lands. The federal government manages more than half of Idaho, Alaska, Oregon, and Utah, and about 85% or more of Nevada. There are parks and wildlife refuges, but a great swath of public lands is managed by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. By law, they have to balance preservation and economic exploitation. And in fact, when they were created as agencies, economic exploitation was kind of at the top of their agenda. Now, many decades after these agencies were created, facing the twin threats of a changed climate and mass extinction, we need to ask hard questions about what we've been doing with public lands and what we're going to do in the future. We don't have much time left to transform things and avoid potentially irreversible economic, social, and environmental calamities. Today's panelists will dig into that role, into the role the management of our public lands can play in protecting nature, reducing climate emissions, and supporting communities on the frontiers of climate impacts, like some of those the island communities we heard from this morning. Our three panelists are steeped in the question of what needs to be done. After working for years on climate and energy policy in Congress, Isaac Brown is executive director now of a national organization of venture capitalists and business executives. They believe cutting oil and gas development on public lands is necessary and essential to fight climate change. His group is called the Business Coalition for Conservation and the Climate, or to its friends, C3. Stephenne Harden has spent many years in the thick of these issues, advising in the Senate, advising Montana's John Tester and New Mexico's Tom Udall. She led the efforts to protect Chaco Canyon and reform the 1872 law that controls and favors mining companies and is still in force. She now leads the National Geographic Society's effort to get policymakers to back ambitious targets to protect 30% of the planet by 2030, and will be attending a major conference in China on this subject. And Jim Lyons, to my right, spent decades working on our government's national resource policy. He was Clinton's Undersecretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources and the Environment, which meant he was the chief overseer of the Forest Service. And for President Obama, he worked as Assistant Secretary of Interior, focused on energy and land management and things like the sage grouse. He's now a lecturer at the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And with that, I'm going to start off with some questions. Isaac, to start with you.
Sure.
Your new business coalition focuses on climate issues and the intersection with public lands. What do business leaders care? Why do business leaders care about how public lands fit into the national climate picture?
Sure, absolutely. That's an excellent question. I know we're not supposed to go too far into who we are, but just thank you again. My name is Isaac Brown. I am the Executive Director of the Business Coalition for Conservation and Climate. And we were really founded because business leaders recognize that climate change generally presents a clear and present danger to them, both in terms of their investments. It presents a challenge to the companies that they invest in, but then also on a personal level, of course, they're very concerned about climate change and what it means to our way of life. And specifically, they are very concerned about the proliferation of oil and gas development on public lands in the United States. And it's troubling for them both in terms of the impact and the fact that it seems to be skirting national attention. So there's a lot of focus right now on climate change, and we're grateful for that, but the public lands component of this doesn't seem to be getting the amount of attention that it warrants. And so, in terms of the perspective in this, the amount of oil and gas that's developed on public lands actually makes the federal government one of the largest energy asset managers in the world. 42% of coal production in the United States occurs on public lands, 26% of oil production occurs on public lands, and 13% of natural gas production occurs on public lands. And so when you take a step back and think about what that means, if the public lands in the United States were its own country, it would rank 5th in the world in terms of emissions. And so for us, we really look at this as both a huge public crisis, but also a significant opportunity. And what we want to try to do is leverage the experience that we've seen and the successes that we've seen in the private sector, where investors and shareholders are really driving some of the nation's largest and traditionally heaviest polluters to literally change the way that they are operating to reduce carbon emissions. One example I often talk about is that shareholders were able to negotiate into the CEO of Shell Oil's compensation package emission reduction targets as part of his compensation package. So these are the types of things that we're seeing happening in the private sector. And the point that we want to make today, and certainly moving forward, is that the American people, as shareholders in public lands, they too can demand the same accountability and change from the federal government.
So Stephanie, just turning to you briefly, you're helping lead a global effort to protect wild nature. An international report in May on biodiversity showed that the current global approach to biodiversity conservation is inadequate, and we need transformative change. What does that look like, and what does it mean for our public lands?
Thanks for that question. And thank you for having me here. So we need transformative change, and that's why audacious goals like protecting 30% of the planet in the next decade need to sort of be put on the radar. We know that nature and nature-based solutions are one of the most important drivers for us to be able to address climate change. At least a third of the climate problem can be solved simply by protecting what we have. So we need to start there. But to bring that back to the United States, and I think to balance the other pieces that Isaac brings up, does anyone actually know how much of the United States is currently protected in perpetuity? Anyone? It's 13%. And when we actually look at that, over 6% of that is actually just in Alaska. The other 7% is in the lower 48 states. And so when we're talking about shifting from being an oil and a gas producer into sort of a conservation producer, people who can go ahead and produce the carbon benefit, the water benefit, the oxygen benefit, those offsets, we need to rethink how we do that. And so if we're talking about transformational change in the US on our public lands, the first thing we need to do is get rid of laws that were written in 1872. And so when we think about things like the 1872 mining law that still has manifest destiny written into it and says that the highest and best use of all lands must be to mine them, or the ability to take oil and gas leases in the US and literally hold up for decades any other option for development, including clean energy as a solution that we want to be deploying, there's a real game there that we need to be attacking and changing in the way that our laws are both written and implemented. But I think to Isaac's point about business, if we're looking for that really transformative change here in the US, that comes by setting the markets that the lands that we have here in the US can be driven by. So I think we need to find the market signals. We need to be able to build those structures where there is value in something else. And that's a theme here throughout the conference, but I think it's a hard one when it comes to public lands because it really does take Wall Street and the government sort of working together to figure out how to set the rules of the road so there is something to invest in, and those communities and those landowners, the general public, can go ahead and be able to invest in those new markets. So,
Thank you, Stephanie. Jim, this just to follow on what she said. What opportunities do public lands present for helping address the causes and consequences of climate change for the West, and particularly for Western communities?
Well, thanks for that question, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today, and thanks to Amy for putting this excellent conference together. I actually think the public lands hold tremendous potential to help contribute to both addressing the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And there really are three keys. Isaac touched on the first, which is to reduce the amount of emissions that are associated with energy development on public lands. It's a significant concern, and one that is accelerated by a current administration that has emphasized oil and gas leasing and coal production as a part of its portfolio, reversing policies that were put in place by the previous administration as we attempted to address the climate issue. The second, though, is increasing renewable energy production on public lands. And there again, under the Obama administration, a significant commitment was made to the production of solar energy and wind energy on public lands, and an opportunity actually to promote geothermal energy production. And we saw gains in production. We actually went essentially from zero to a significant increase in production, and did so in a way that sought to balance both the conservation of those lands for water, wildlife, recreation, and other uses, while encouraging the production of renewable energy. But I think the third role that public lands can play is in helping to sequester carbon. And so an important opportunity exists to make investments in public lands, not only to preserve additional lands, which are essential, but also to make investments to restore many of the landscapes that have been adversely impacted by development, by insects and disease, by wildfire, both forest fire and rangeland fire, which have had a big impact on those landscapes. And that investment will not only help address climate, but will also help us preserve the ecological integrity of these areas, which is essential to address the biodiversity crisis.
Jim, just could you follow up and say how to sequester carbon on public lands?
Well, essentially, what we need to do is to address the reforestation backlog that exists on the National Forest System, which is substantial. We need to address invasive species, which are having a tremendous impact on rangelands. Sheetgrass is a great example, which is an invasive that actually increases the risk of fire and destroys essential sagebrush habitat, which is critical not only to the greater sage grouse, which I spent my last 3.5 years in the federal government working on, but 350 other species associated with what has been characterized as the most endangered ecosystem in North America. Those investments provide opportunities for jobs and ecological restoration. They provide opportunities for climate mitigation, and they will help not only restore the integrity and the resilience of these landscapes, but they contribute to the resilience of rural communities, many of which are suffering because of downturns in agriculture, which some of you heard this morning, and really a renewed focus on urban development and the exodus of many people from these rural communities.
Thanks, Jim.
do you mind if I actually, sorry, can I have?
Please.
So Jim mentioned the fact that for reforestation on U.S. federal lands alone could be a significant contribution. Senator Udall, we wrote a bill when I worked there that basically forced the Forest Service to increase their investment in that project over time. And of the U.S. contributions for our nationally determined contribution on climate, just reforesting in the next decade what's not forested now could be one of the 26% that we need to reduce. That could take 1% alone. So when we look at federal lands and we think about the contribution they can have by just switching the policy, that's how we can directly sort of go back to that climate piece. Sorry.
No, please. Isaac, two things have happened simultaneously in the nation going in opposite directions. The government that is currently in power basically came in and reversed everything that was being done to help energy management, to help reduce carbon from public lands. At the same time, the private sector you work with had more and more examples of companies doing things that would seem to be against their economic interest to further the reduction of greenhouse gases. Is there something that the private sector as an energy manager should teach the federal government as an energy manager? What are the lessons?
Well, I think part of the challenge is the premise of your question. So I think for our members, they don't necessarily view it as an either-or calculation. So our members really believe in the double bottom line principle, which is that you can make investments that both have a strong economic return but also have a positive social impact as well. And that's really the way that they've chosen to live their lives and run their businesses the way they run them. It's also really frustrating because, and I referenced the Shell example, but there are countless examples right now of corporations across the country recognizing that climate change poses such a significant threat to their long-term trajectory that they are taking real-time steps to reduce their carbon footprint and encouraging their counterparts to do the same. One example that I often turn to is the Sustainable Accountability Standards Board, SASB. I really prefer
another acronym.
I prefer the acronym though to the full name, I have to tell you. So their whole premise, and they are an organization, nonprofit organization that was founded by leading investors from across the country. And essentially what they've done is try to replicate the FASB model. Every year, every publicly traded company is required to submit a report to the SEC, essentially outlining their financial health. And so SASB has come along and developed very comprehensive standards on emissions and said that companies should be required to undergo the same type of analysis and report to the public how these companies are performing from a climate perspective, from an emissions perspective. And these standards have been wildly successful. You've got over 30 major companies across the United States. Companies like Halliburton have adopted these standards and are right now complying with those standards and reporting every year on the types of methane emissions, carbon emissions, the practices that they're undergoing to reduce emissions. So I think when we think about the discourse in Washington right now, the conversation that the administration is putting forward, and it's from an old playbook, right, is regulation is bad for the economy, and by reducing regulation, you're expanding business opportunity. And you're really seeing the public push back, the private sector push back, and just one example would be on the methane rules. So the federal government has, both BLM and EPA, have rolled back rules that were put in place into 2016 to reduce methane emissions. The administration is pushing those back. You've got companies like BP saying, no, we need national standards on methane.
I'd interrupt and say on the fuel efficiency regs, the
Yes.
car companies are pushing back.
Yes, and in fact, there was a major vote taken at the GM shareholders meeting in June, and that's an example of shareholder advocacy making a difference in terms of what these companies are doing on those issues.
Okay, and I want to move to Stephanie quickly. And can you give a broad brush picture of what are the biggest drivers of the unprecedented decline in biodiversity in natural areas, and how does it relate to climate change, and how can public lands help?
Yeah, so for those of you who might have missed in May, we mentioned there was this large report that came out and said on current track we will lose 1 million species in the next decade. We've already significantly impacted 75% of the Earth's surface in terms of terrestrial land, and 66% of the oceans are fundamentally altered. And so when we look at those numbers, and we also look at the land report that will come out in a couple of weeks from the IPCC, which I think will echo a lot of that, we see the big drivers are actually almost circular in what's happening. The impacts of climate change alone is one of the biggest drivers to biodiversity loss. There's an estimate that 1 in 6 species will disappear or migrate or move due to climate change. And that's on top of the added impacts of land change, right? So we're losing in the United States, just to bring it back to the US, around 1.5 million acres a year, generally to sort of general development, strip malls, housing, anything else that comes up, that farmland trust concept that was talked about earlier. And so with that rate of reduction, just here, but also globally for every decision we make, that really continues to drive biodiversity loss. And there's a good chance that of the estimated 10 million species we think are out there, we may literally never get to even know millions of them. They'll go away before we actually see them. And then I would just note that the last thing is it is the extractive industry pieces as well, right? Overfishing, mining, oil and gas, ag conversion for land. Those things are really driving that. And so a lot of the big solutions are about, again, I think as Jim pointed out well, is preserving what we have left. That's the effort that we're working on with the Campaign for Nature, and really driving governments to hold on to those pieces. But also then restoring and really looking at this new and emerging science on what we can find out to be true about restoration, and how we can drive that economy, both domestically and globally, and we're seeing some really great examples of where that's working here and in places like the Amazon.
So I just want to emphasize this point, if it hasn't been emphasized enough. By investing in restoration, we get 3 benefits. We can help deal with the climate crisis. We can help restore and maintain essential habitats. At the same time, help protect water resources and other essential resources that are important to not only rural economies, but to urban areas as well. And I think we can finally, and most importantly, shift the focus of public land management from the traditional and original extractive industry focus to one that recognizes a much more progressive approach, capitalizing on the ecosystem services that are provided by these landscapes. So that single investment provides a whole host of benefits that not only benefit our economy, the climate, biodiversity, but they really help, I think, utilize a public resource in its most effective and efficient way.
You, not surprisingly, slightly anticipated my next question, but to ask it from a slightly different angle, local communities near public lands had the sensation that they should be able to get economic benefit. They should be able to log. They should be able to mine, that this was the support of their communities. Mm-hmm. That's been their mindset for decades. You're talking about a whole new mindset. How do you convince local communities that what you're talking about in ecosystem services are in their interest? How do you change the mindset?
Well, you know, I've lived that transition in my prior experiences in government. I think people are coming to realize the importance of these opportunities. Yes, timbering has declined. Mining to some degree has declined. Ranching is struggling right now, probably more because of changes in market conditions than anything else. So communities are looking for transitions. They're looking for opportunities. I think the key is to sit down with communities and with the potential new clients or new opportunities that are provided and have conversations, like the conversation we're having here at this conference, bringing investors together with ecologists and as well as people who understand the economics of these communities and have a conversation about what a transition might look like and how it might benefit these communities. Those experiments are occurring across the landscape, and hopefully they will bear fruit. But I think the key is to help people see that their future is not based on the traditional uses that have historically supported those communities.
Not based on their past.
That's right.
Well, and I think you have to add into that, we have an incentive structure in much of the West that ties directly to those communities getting payments based on resource extraction. Mm-hmm. So whether that's secure rural schools, which gives timber receipts back to communities, or that's oil and gas receipts, or what, yeah, correct, that expired. Leave Congress for 4 months and things go into heaven. But those payment structures are very much in that sense. And what's even ironic about it is that in the Gulf Coast, they're making arguments right now they should be getting more of those payments from oil and gas to offset the impacts of climate. So we have to think about the structure of the payments that we already have in these rural communities, and how do we flip those? The sort of dream, insane transformation would be to take a program like Secure Rural Schools and make it based on ecosystem service payments rather than on something else.
I'd also add that, from our perspective, there's a really interesting transition happening right now, particularly amongst that, our venture capitalists talk about quite a bit. So, if you are investing in an innovative, growing company, one of the things that you think about is this a company that is going to be able to recruit and retain top-level talent? So the traditional model has been you set up shop in Menlo Park, Silicon Valley, and you grow your company that way, and maybe Aaron Sorkin makes a movie about you someday, and everything is great. Well, the reality today is that the cost of living in those areas is so cost prohibitive that companies are really, and venture capitalists are really thinking creatively about how best to situate companies to allow them to grow. The sort of the ethos that a lot of our members talk about is, people in these companies work hard and they want to play hard. And so access to recreation has increasingly become a key component of where a lot of these innovative companies want to locate. If you go on any sort of growing innovative company's website and you look under their career tab, you'll notice often that they will promote or highlight the fact that they're near a national park or near some type of national monument, because they want prospective employees to understand that that they are competitive with the larger tech companies that can provide a holistic life experience. And so I think that's one of the things.
Hiking is better than ping pong.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we actually did a survey through the Muse where we asked 4,000 employees of innovative companies across the United States, primarily millennials, and said, in terms of your priorities when you are thinking about the type of company that you want to work for, what are the considerations that you're looking for? 25% had access to recreation as one of their top 4. Excuse me, I flipped this around. 75% said access to recreation was one of their top 4. 25% said it was their top priority. So one of the things that we often talk to policymakers about is when you are thinking about one of these cherished areas of public lands, and you're doing a cost calculation about what the economic benefits or impact could be of a particular lease, you have to also consider what the opportunity what the opportunity cost is of degrading those areas.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Really quick question, because I want to turn it over to the audience momentarily. But Jim was talking about local communities. You've talked about local communities. There are local indigenous communities, the Navajo, that have had huge economic benefits from having coal plants, like the Navajo Generating Station or the San Juan Generating Plant. It's provided them with jobs in the plants, it's provided them with mining jobs. Those are likely to go away. Mm-hmm. What is the future for indigenous peoples living near public lands?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really great question, and I'll answer it as quickly as I can in 2 formats. So speaking specifically about Navajo Generating Station, I think the stunning statistic that sort of stopped me when I worked for Tom was 83% of the Hopi Nation gets some income from someone who works at the plant or at the mine. So when the plant goes away, literally the entire economic system in northern Arizona and northern New Mexico fundamentally shifts. And so without a just transition and a way to really think about what that means for those communities, we're basically asking them to bear the brunt of something that they actually didn't ask for to begin with. We just didn't want to dam the Grand Canyon, which was a good idea too. So I think when we look at that community, they have some benefits and they are starting to make some plans about how to do that, but we have to start by asking them for what they want to see in their community. And I think we have to start that conversation early and often and be ready to do that as that phases out. They in particular have the benefit of one of the largest transmission lines that comes into the West, and so they also have the benefit of great wind and great solar. So if anybody's looking for an investment project, Navajo Nation is actually ready and willing. So just noting that out there. To the second piece on indigenous communities though, I think one of the things we know is that someone said yesterday, we need a feminist solution to get us out of this. The same tools that have worked globally, that have worked in the United States around conservation and protection, and also those economies are not necessarily going to be the same things that work in the future. And so asking those communities what they think success is, what they want to see their economies look like, and what those models are is a really important piece.
That's fantastic. I did want to turn it over to the audience. We don't have too much time left, but it would be great if you all have questions. If not, we'll just keep going here. But is there a question? Over there,
There's
sir.
one.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So I was a county commissioner here for 12 years and worked a lot with county government officials from around the country. Guys in Utah, Colorado, Louisiana, who are absolutely wedded to the current model, fought against the methane rule, won all the oil and gas subsidies, just like you're saying. It doesn't surprise me what you said, ma'am, about, wanting oil and gas to fight climate change, oil and gas royalties. So considering that this is about transforming leadership, I'd like you to talk for a moment about working with how to empower local communities to help transform their local economies, recognize these new opportunities, and move on into a new economic paradigm for themselves. Many of them are small rural places.
Great question. Turn it over to whoever wants to pick it up.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think, yes, they fight tooth and nail to protect what they have. But there are leaders within those communities who see that the past is not the future, as we just said. And I think it's important in that context to think about the perverse incentives that currently exist. And in fact, I think begin to revisit the purpose of public lands generally. I mean, what is the mission of our public lands, and what should they seek to achieve? And I think that conversation does have to occur on a local level. And I think when you bring people together and help them understand that what supported them in the past is just running out because of economic conditions, because of climate conditions, a whole host of things, I think enlightened leaders then step up. The bigger fight is going to be in Washington against the lobbyists who represent all these interests. I mean, I would suggest in the new administration it's time to revisit the purpose of the public lands and the perverse incentives that exist. What new incentives should be put in place? You know, Gifford Pinchot, when he was chief of the Forest Service, got the direction from the Secretary of Agriculture, he actually wrote the direction, that the public land should be managed for the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. I think we would all agree that the greatest good for the greatest number is not continuing oil and gas extraction and timbering, though they can continue in appropriate places. It's addressing the threat of climate change. It's addressing the threat of loss of biodiversity. It's dealing with limited water resources, et cetera. That is the future. We need to revisit our purpose here and then provide incentives for communities, individual landowners, farm owners, to help us move forward as a nation to achieve that new vision for America, which is based on a healthier climate and certainly a greater investment in dealing with the challenges of climate and biodiversity.
I'll grab you after and we can talk about some specific examples, but we'll give one other
Okay,
person.
we have 1 minute left, so I'll take one more question if there's one out there. Ah, right here, excuse me.
You folks haven't talked much about the impact of the Trump administration on public land.
We-
Maybe that's because there hasn't been much, or because he's too scary to talk
Ladder.
But I guess the
You want to go
question
first?
is, if you're a leader in the public or private sector, how do you deal with what's happening right now differently than if it was in the Obama era, for instance?
Yeah.
So I'll just tell you how we're thinking about this, and I don't want to take, I know we only have 1 minute left. So we are very focused on January 20th, 2021, frankly. Because of the fact, the unique way in which public lands are managed, this is one of the few areas where a new administration could literally make on an administrative level some pretty specific changes. So we're really viewing the next 18 months as a period to do two things. One, we want to make sure that the public understands the scope of this problem on public land specifically and the unique role they can play in trying to fix it. And then we do also want to kind of work with legislators to try to address some low-hanging fruit, but I think for the sake of time, I'm happy to talk to you about it after, but Chairman Lowenthal, who's the chair of the Energy Subcommittee for Natural Resources in the House, is going to introduce a bill in September, the Transparency in Energy Production Act, which would actually require companies to disclose their climate impacts for land developed on public lands. I think those are the types of things we could try to address in the short term.
Okay, I'll let Jim finish it off. Oh, did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, we
Believe
can
me.
go. We can go for hours.
I'll give you 10 seconds.
I would say in 10 seconds though, one of the interesting things is smart companies, like the example that I think Isaac gave earlier, or on cars, are recognizing that the pendulum swings quickly, and so the idea of getting smart regulation in some ways, like methane, which actually increased the amount of money that the state of New Mexico was receiving in royalty payments when that regulation went in, so it was a win-win-win, and increased job growth. When those things happen, they should take the smarter ones than trying to always argue for the best one, because the pendulum swing itself is actually detrimental to their long-term regulatory structure. And so I think you'll see a difference between the companies who are thoughtful about this and those who are in the long run. And
So I will offer this. You have no idea the pain of having spent 35 years working to move from the old paradigm to a progressive approach to managing public lands for the greatest good, and then see these idiots come in and do what they're doing without any knowledge and with a hidden agenda. It is incredibly troubling. I would close with this. As Felicity said, 1/3 of the American landscape is owned by all of us. And using the private sector model, we're all shareholders. We should speak up as shareholders and make very clear that the old paradigm no longer works, that the current administration is not looking out for the greatest good. They are looking out for the greatest good for them, and get them the hell out of office.
So I would, as a journalist, there's nothing I like better than learning new things. And everybody here has taught me something that I didn't know before. I thank these panelists very much and turn it back over to Amy. Thank you.